Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page, and I'm so grateful that you're choosing to spend your time with us. If you're unfamiliar with our podcast, or if you are familiar, it's a good reminder that we're here to have conversations that we hope will change the face of public education. Today, we had a conversation with our friend Jessie Fouts, who found herself as a student at SOTA, under the mentorship of our friend Robin, has now found herself as a teacher and a mentor at SOTA, and talks about the reciprocal relationship of her relationship with Robin, how it's shown up in her work, and ideas about how maybe we should center teachers, essentially, in shaping the face of public education. I know that the idea sounds simple, but it felt monumental. As we were talking, you'll see more in our conversation. Jessie has some brilliant ideas about what mentorship looks like, about how we can prioritize the mental health of teachers, and how we can lean in to changing, ever-changing, right, the relationship that we have as humans with education. So thank you for joining us, and without further ado, is our conversation with our friend Jessie.
Our school, we really believe in relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartedly believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time. The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent.
Introduce yourself, Jessie.
My name is Jessie Ann Fouts. I'm 34 years old, and I am a special ed and math teacher at Tacoma School of the Arts.
And my name is Zach Varnell, and I'm one of the co-directors that work across all three of the schools, SOTA, Sammy, and Idea, and I am 42 years old.
Everyone also has to say their zodiac sign. I'm a Scorpio.
Okay, I agree to that. I'm an Aries.
Yeah. I'm Christian. I'm 30 years old. I do cool stuff with SOTA and Sammy in particular, and I am a Sagittarius. Did you guess that?
Okay, so this is really interesting because Aries is my moon sign and Sagittarius is my rising sign. So we're like the whole trifecta of my
So this is like a solar system right here.
This
basically.
is like, and yeah, this is a really important moment.
It's just kind of you having a conversation with you.
Yeah. Perfect.
That's great.
Yeah.
So what are we modeling today, Christian? Tell us what we're modeling.
So in the interest of our circle question, right, there's always a good question that we ask at the beginning, sometimes low risk, sometimes high risk, right, to get people to get to know each other a little bit more. And so I think the question that I'm interested in as we're talking about identity today, or kind of discovering or exploring your identity, is when did you know that you'd be a teacher?
So I attended SOTA. I am an alumni. I graduated in 2007, and I was kind of one of those kids where I wasn't planning on going to college. I had been dealing with just like some stuff at home. My dad had cancer my whole time through high school, and I wanted to go out and be an artist, and I didn't want to have to fit with like in a mold at all. And one of my first jobs outside of high school was working for Metro Parks and teaching dance and theater and music and some of their visual arts classes. And working with kids was just super fun for me, and in a way that I didn't think it would be. And then obviously 10 years went by, and when Kettler approached me 7 years ago, he was like, "Hey, what's your next step in life?" And I was like, "I don't know, dude. I'm just, just trying to figure it out. I have kind of all these ideas about what I want to do next, and I know that I want to go to grad school." And he was like, "Well, would you want to be a teacher?" And I was like, "Yeah, but I don't think I'd be good at it." And so he offered me the job. And so probably August 29th, 2016, I knew I was going to be a teacher. That's when I knew.
Yeah. What about you, Zach?
So funny story. many people might not know this, but Jessie was a student when I was teaching at SOTA. And when did you graduate? 2007? So my first year teaching at SOTA was 2004. Very similar story. I had no desire to become a teacher. None whatsoever. I finished college and I could not wait to never go back to school. I was done with it. I was so excited to have a life outside of like the traditional 10-month school calendar kind of experience. And started playing music, was into songwriting and working in studios and working on different records. Was trying to kind of create a career around music, which is a really hard thing to do. And similar thing, John Kettler approached me after a solo concert that I had here in Tacoma, and he said, hey, we're starting the songwriting program. You should come and teach songwriting and teach audio recording, and we're building a studio. I said, wow, that sounds really interesting. What a great side gig to have while I start my budding career and a way to try to make some extra money. And so he gave me his business card, and I called him, and he never called me back for like a year. And so then like a year later, he said, oh, we finally got the funding. We want to actually do this program. Do you want to start? And I think it was like week 2 that I wanted to become a teacher full time. We got all the kids together. The first week, we just kind of talked about music and why they were there for recording. I had no idea what I was doing. Totally outside of my element, winging it completely. I spent all summer like putting together all these materials. I was terrified. And we went down into the recording studio, and I had kids go into the room and like start playing in a band. Like, okay, you pick up guitar. Let's figure out, just put something down so we can record and listen to it. And I remember this kid, Ben Roth, picked up a guitar, and he looked at his buddy, John Lamberton, and they started playing this song together. And I was sitting there watching them experience this and like come up with something. And it just immediately clicked to me, like, this is so much more fun and interesting to me. Watching kids have that experience and just trying to set the stage for them to have that experience was way more interesting than anything, I could do on my own. And it is kind of what being a producer and a recording engineer is about. It's about creating the scenario for magic to happen. And I think, honestly, that's what teaching is about cultivating the experience so that kids can come into that educational awakening, so to speak, that like creative experience. It's not necessarily having all the answers and being the person on the stage that knows everything. It's being able to build the scenario where learning can happen. And that was what was so fascinating to me. So as soon as we set that up, I was like, this is incredible. What about you, Christian?
Yeah, same boat. I think as both of you, right? I think this is just you having a conversation with you. Right, I didn't necessarily see myself as a teacher when I was coming out of high school. I found myself working in admissions when I was in college. I was the person who walked really fast backward. You all have been on college campus tours. Mm-hmm. I was that guy. And then I kind of morphed into going to places where there were a lot of large populations like first-gen students, and then walking them through the process of getting to college. And then one of the things that I found out, like I was really passionate about that, but one of the things that made me upset is that if I was having conversations with them in their junior and senior year about college, it was probably already too late. For a lot of students, right? Had there been some corrective action, or had they known that certain resources existed, that they would have had a better shot at getting in. And so I found myself working in K-12. I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. There was one day I was at Newport High School. I was guest teaching in my friend Savannah's class, and we were talking about the Harlem Renaissance. And on like 3 or 4 occasions, Savannah was like, yo, these students have never said anything in my classroom. And right, like they can't stop talking while you're here. And so, right, like I think just something clicked. We were talking about like using literary devices, but I used rappers instead of people who would traditionally show up in that space. And right, like we just had really cool conversation. And then, I started teaching that more often, and then found myself, right, like in a place where I'm like at a crossroads. Do I leave? Do I jump ship? I got married, got my first apartment, and graduated from college all in the same day.
Dang.
And so
the
same day, crazy, right?
Wait, say that again. So you got married, graduated from college, and what was the third one?
Married, graduated from college, and our first apartment.
And your first apartment all in the same day.
All in the same day.
Wow.
And so I'm like 22, right? Like,
yeah.
What in the world, right? Like if I take on this master's degree, you know what I mean? Like I would incur a large amount of debt.
Yeah.
Right. I would have to student teach for free in somebody's classroom. And so I think that there were just a lot of barriers of finding myself in teaching. But I knew that I wanted to, right? And then I was presented with the opportunity at SOTA. I had built like a year-long curriculum. I don't know who else is nerdy enough to build a year-long curriculum without a job, right? Found myself in that place, and then Bliss called.
Yeah.
And I popped up, and then Joni called, and I popped up, and I've kind of just enjoyed the journey since.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about this in the context of, discovering yourself. It's one of the 4 goals we focus on in Mentor Group. And for me, as a mentor, like I transitioned from being an adjunct instructor teaching music and stuff to then, when I added on the Mentor Group, that was another huge step for me as a teacher to be like, oh my gosh, I got to fill a whole Friday, talk about feelings and social emotional learning. That's not something I'm super comfortable with. But as you grow and realize that's actually the most important thing, and helping kids identify who they are and struggle through those iterations. It's an iterative process, right? Like kids finding who they are, it can be, transformational, but it can also be a huge barrier when there's things that prevent kids or when they don't feel like they have the space to try on different identities. And I think educators don't talk enough, in my opinion, about the process of finding identity and like discovering identity and trying on identities, right? Like when I was 15, the super embarrassing story, I remember being 15 and being like, hey, I think I'm like into like punk rock and like hardcore music. And this was like the early 90s. And so I like, shaved my head and then dyed like a strip of blonde hair and started wearing a wallet chain and like
just a phase, Mom.
Exactly. And it's like it's a cliche, right? It's a joke, but that's a huge part of adolescent development is trying on identities and then seeing how the world reacts. As a young person, you go, I don't really feel like who I'm seeing and how the world sees me is how I feel. So I'm going to try something new and then see what happens. And that experimental process of saying, I'm going to put out this in the world. I'm going to put myself out there in this way and then see how people respond and see how that makes me feel is a super healthy thing to do as a young person. And as we as mentors think about how we guide students through that process and reflect on that, that's transformational. Like it's important to go through that. And I feel like a lot of times what becomes a barrier is you have institutions that prevent kids or restrict them from trying on identities or experimenting with different identities in healthy ways that allow them to try to figure it out, because it's not, it's not like they're changing who they are. They're experimenting. They're trying to see, how do I fit into the world? And if we talk about community as a huge part of one of our pillars, it becomes about, if I'm a part of a community, what does that mean? And how do I fit into that community? What is my place? What is my role? And that's all about identity.
I think also as creatives, one thing before I got into teaching was like, what do I have to offer? Like I know how to choreograph a dance. I know how to put together a play. I know how to write a poem. I know how to slam a poem, but I don't really know if I can like help facilitate learning. And then when I got into teaching and saw that there were just all these different ways that, that could look, it made me feel like you can bring creativity into how you do it. And like, I think I used to think of teachers as like, they were the people that had the knowledge and that they were supposed to give it to the students. And now it's kind of more of like you're walking alongside the student and you're helping them develop that as you're also like becoming a new person every year too. I hope that as teachers that we're constantly like re-evaluating who we are and we're re-finding ourselves in every new class that comes in, because if we were to stay the same, then like what are we doing? But I like that changed for me, that it didn't have to be like me standing in front of a classroom and being like, you have to do this is what it has to look like, these are the things that we have to accomplish this year, but that like the students then get to have agency as well, and what do we want to do, how do we want to do this, like what can this look like? And I think that conversation around teaching and around identity is a really big hot topic right now, especially with like what's going on politically in our country, and how we're allowing space for students to find themselves and be who they are, and how we're telling them the truth about where we're all coming from. And and
it becomes tricky. There's so many different categories when you talk about identity that become things that kids will latch onto. Like, I talked about my identity experience when I was 15, had to do with music, had to do with, fashion, if you want to call it fashion. It was not very fashionable, but it had to do with the way that I present myself to the world. obviously, and we talk about constructs and the way that, a community perceives someone, gender is a huge part of that. And that becomes a big thing that kids start to experiment with and start to think about. Gender comes with it a huge list of expectations based on societal expectations, and then some of them are really contextual. If you're talking about sports or music or even academia, especially in things like STEM, identity as it relates to gender becomes a really important way that kids relate themselves to the community. And so as kids start to experiment with that and try out, like, maybe if I present myself differently, will I be accepted differently? Will I feel differently in how my skills get used? Like that becomes a big thing.
I think that just you made a really interesting point, and like I pick up on words a lot, right? Because that's my thing. And I think that like our role in the conversation, I love that you use the word facilitate, right? And like the root word of facilitate is facile. And facile means to make easy.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I think that the environment, right, whether we're talking about wherever somebody is exploring their identity, whether that be gender, whether that be race, whether that be punk rock chains and yellow mohawks, right? But I think like that container, our role there is to make that easy.
Right.
Right. And a chance for students to be able to do that in what I would consider to be a low risk environment. As opposed to, right, trying some of those things out in a place where there's not mentor group, where people don't care about them as much as potentially we do. And so I love that you use that word, right? And I think in the conversation, as we're like talking about equity, the thing that always sticks in my mind is like when we've been accustomed to some form of privilege, right, the leveling of the playing field feels like loss. And so like I find it, and I know we're like crossing into political territory, but I find it scary that we would try to take some of those things out of learning environments by force. And so I think that that's tough, right? Like if our job is to prepare people for the world that they're going to live in, right, but we create the bubble where none of the identities that we don't, you know what I mean? Like, the ideas that we don't agree with can't be here feels weird. I wish I had a much more poignant thing to say about that.
I think that as as facilitators of learning and like supporters of learning in a classroom, it's also understanding that like, yeah, kids are going to feel that loss and kids are going to be uncomfortable, and that we create a space for that too. Like,
yeah,
it's okay for you to feel like that way, and how are we going to move forward and through that? And how are we how do we support that happening without isolating too? And because everybody's figuring themselves out within a classroom setting like that, and within social emotional learning, within identity stuff. And so I think that, like you said, like being in a low stakes environment and having that realization is like a safe space to like grieve the loss of what you thought you knew or how you were raised, and to learn how to do it differently. I think that's like why SOTA is so great, and I mean the other three schools or the other
and I think so. Bringing it back to mentor group, I mean I think that is the really tough job of a mentor. If you think about mentor planning curriculum, you're going to teach lessons or you're going to try to deliver some sort of content to kids. Like that's not what mentor group's about, right? Like sure, there's lesson plans that have been developed. We've got hundreds that we've used over the years that facilitate different conversations, but really the goal is to create an environment where some of these uncomfortable conversations can happen in a safe way that is inclusive, that allows for that flexibility of students that are feeling like this is kind of uncomfortable for me, but I feel safe enough to engage in it with this group of people. And that only comes in the type of setting where you have relationship, right? If you know your mentees and you've been with them for years and you know your mentor and trust them, you are more willing as an individual to enter into those hard conversations and talk about them. And you've met with in student-led conferences with your mentor and your parents or family members or whoever multiple times. And so you get to the point where you go, I feel safe to talk about these hard issues or to try different identities and to say how I relate to this group, how I relate to the world. I'm trying something different because I don't know if it fits me. The goal is for a mentor group to be able to get to that point where that safety exists. And like you said, it's about facilitating. It's not about delivering content. It's about creating that experience where that safety happens. And that actually, it takes a ton of work. It's really hard. I don't know if you feel it. I feel like it's hard.
I don't know. I feel like when I realized that teaching was about building relationships and less about having to harbor all of this knowledge.
Yes.
For me, that took a lot of pressure off. I think that the one thing that I've always done well in life is building relationships. I've always been like really social. I've always made friends really easily.
Yeah.
I always like jokingly tell the story that my older brother was having issues like socially growing. And so my parents sent me to preschool with him to like help him make friends. So I've kind of just like always been in that role where like bringing people together has always been something that I love doing. And I think that when you are coming at some kids that haven't been exposed to that kind of like someone like wanting to reach out and to bring them in and to create community with them, and then you see them like the next year like running mentor group and like coming to all the first looks and like running everything at camp, that is like the best. And I mean, and those kids are like constantly like finding themselves over and over and over again. Like they're coming in as these quiet freshmen and then they're leaving as leaders. And I think that mentor group has like such an impact on that. But yeah, I think that, like I said, like it took a lot of pressure off when I realized that it was just like, all you have to do is just kind of create a space here and get like a conversation moving, and everything else is just going to like go naturally by itself. And that's been the easiest part.
Yeah, you're probably a lot better at it than I am. For me, what was hard is it's not so much like, yeah, I totally agree. Taking the pressure off of creating content or delivering knowledge was great. The hard thing for me is the follow-up like being able to look around the room and saying, okay, I can tell this kid's uncomfortable. How do I find space to engage with that kid, like create more of a relationship and focus on that so that he continues to be pulled in? There's always the handful of like one or two mentees that are sitting off in the corner. They're not super engaged. How do I bring them in? And they have to be, who can I pair with? It's like there's all these moves you can do as a mentor to try to like build community, and it's the one-on-one conversation. So when I say it's more work, that's what I mean. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of recognizing and seeing what's going on and then reacting to it and taking the necessary steps individually to make sure that kids are actually involved and feel welcome. You can't just like stand up in front and read your lesson plan and then go home. Like you have to actually pay attention to what's happening.
And I think that can be intimidating for teachers that are coming in.
Oh, yeah.
But I also think that when you realize that it's just this, it's like the magic wand in your back pocket,
Yep.
like after you've been here for a few years, then it becomes second nature.
Yeah. And I'll tell you a little like inside traffic like that as a leader in a building, like in one of our schools. It's the same thing with teachers. Like as you do with a mentor group with students, you do the same thing with adults. You recognize who in the group, which one of your teachers are not engaged. What relationships do I have to work on with them to build trust so that I engage them with the group? And we as smaller groups, of teachers start to also create community and create that safe space. Mm-hmm. I mean, it all just kind of scaffolds up.
I love what you said though. And I'm again, big on work. So like the distinction, right? Like, I don't think that that's necessarily difficult. I think it's just time consuming.
Well, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But I think that like the investment is well worth it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Cause like to your point, Jessie, like I've been in spaces long-term with students, whether that be in a teaching format or be in some form of mentorship. And I feel like that safety that you create or that relationship you create like generates trust. Mm-hmm. Right, and that trust generates bravery, oftentimes, on behalf of the mentee. So them finding themselves in leadership, like I feel like, is a direct result of the amount of time spent.
Yes, absolutely.
Oftentimes, just telling them of their strengths, because sometimes we're the last person to find out that we're gifted. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that like having someone who continually creates that space, who's consistently affirming you, who's consistently pulling you back in, even in times where you run backward. You know what I mean? Like, to me, I don't know that that's hard. I think that we do that with select people in our lives, right? And ones that we want to hold on to, or if we're talking really spicy, especially in education spaces, the ones who we think that are worthy of it, right? Yeah. As opposed to just realizing like it's a time-consuming effort that all 25 to 30 of those bodies deserve, right? And am I going to be willing to do it or not? And I know we're strapped for time oftentimes in education, but I think that like...
So I'm going to throw something out there though. I think, I agree with you. I don't think it's that hard. And I think you find over time that it's actually much easier to spend that time in advance than it is to deal with it on the back end when you don't do that.
Exactly.
And then
Absolutely.
Try to manage a class that you have no relationship with. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's surprising how intimidating that is for some teachers.
Tell me about intimidating in building relationships.
I think it's difficult for some teachers, and I don't think so much at the partner schools, SOTA Same Idea, because we talk so much about relationships. But I think in the larger world of education, and I don't mean anyone specifically, I just mean in public education, I think it's intimidating. It's scary for a lot of teachers to say, like, I have to get to know these kids and like call their parents. Like, can you give me a script that I can call so I say the right things? Like, what if I say something wrong? Like, listen, I know a lot about the Pythagorean theorem. I'd rather just talk about that. Like, or man, Western expansion, in 1850, can I just talk about that? Like, talking to this kid about like, what if they talk about abuse or something that's what do I do? I don't know, have the right answers. And the scary thing for teachers is to know that you don't have to have the right answers. And I've said this so many times to teachers that have come and said like, oh, this just happened. What do I do? I'm freaking out. You don't have to do anything. I mean, sometimes you do have to do something, to be clear.
Yeah.
But like most of the time, just being an adult that's willing to listen to a kid and be present and give them eye contact and affirm what they're saying is more than they're getting from any adult in their life.
And something that that we talk about all the time is that, living in a post-COVID world, the mental health and the mental capacity of students right now is really low. I mean, their work stamina is low. Yep. Their, the need to kind of self-isolate is really strong. But what we don't talk about is also how that affected the adults in our culture. And there is this kind of like emotional fragility that I would say that's going on. And, as teachers, like, we all experienced the pandemic too, and I think that it did a number on everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know if there's been a lot of support for us to like learn how to continue to move forward and like recreate ourselves and refigure out who we are while we're also supporting students in doing that. We always talk about the learning is different than it was before COVID. Students are at a different place. They're at a different place emotionally, but so are we. And I think that is really like taking a toll like on staff as a whole too, where those conversations, they seem so much more intimidating and so much bigger just because we're so different emotionally. And it changed us.
Yeah, I mean, that's good to call out. That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think like the biggest difference is.
In students?
No, in adults in that conversation, right? I'm hearing you talk about emotional fragility. Is it like, but that's a byproduct, right? So like, what do you feel has been the biggest challenge, the biggest difficulty?
Controversial.
Why not?
I know, right? Let's go. I would say that the stamina and the I don't want to say tolerance. Maybe the ability to navigate large behaviors and large emotions is different in staff. I think that I think that we all feel a little like, depending on where we are in our emotional journeys, and for those of us that have learned skills to be able to interact with, mental illness and anxiety and all the things that the kids are bringing into the classroom, depending on where we are in that knowledge is really going to reflect how we respond to it. And I think that, what I've noticed for adults post-COVID is just not being able to have the language to identify how we feel and who we are and like how we see ourselves. And I think that when kids come in and they're struggling with identity and they're struggling with mental health, I think it's holding a mirror up to adults. And I think that we're looking at it saying like, I don't even know how to navigate this. I don't even have language for this for myself. I don't know that I can also be the best person for this kid to come to. And I think that goes back to being able to know how to build relationships and to know how to engage in conversation and to engage in circles and to just be able to help facilitate that learning. But I think that like coming at it, vulnerable and open and just like being open about not knowing is also like a good place to be in. But I would say that I have noticed that I think post-COVID, I think adults are struggling too.
Here's what I'm hearing, right? Like the pandemic has impacted students and the way that they show up. And sometimes they may show up with, as you described them, big behaviors in the classroom and things that we need to be able to deal with. Right, I'm also hearing that 90% of our job is relational, 10% of it is curriculum, and there's some difficulties and mirrors that will be shown to us. And my question is, right, like that mentorship relationship still has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Education still has to occur, right? Students still have to be served, right? Like what's the antidote? Like how do we find ourselves being able to sustain teachers and providing teachers with the stamina to sustain students? Is there a third party that has to show up? Is there, right? Like I'm not in the school of like, well, teachers just need to suck it up. Right? Like I'm curious as to essentially asking maybe like what are the needs that have to be met in order for us to still do this effectively?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't have all the answers to that. I mean, we really believe with our 3 schools that and it always has been for 20 years, like this is the most important work. Like before we get to anything else, if I've got 5 priority standards I need to meet by December and I have to get rid of 3 of those because I have to first address relationships and make sure that kids feel safe and feel heard, like that's okay for me. I'm okay with that sacrifice. There's only X amount of hours in the day, and if that's the primary focus of what I need to get to in order to get to those other 3 priority standards or those other 2, then that's worth it, right? You're right, you can't do everything, and you have to sustain the work so that it continues into the future. And I think that's super important. And that's why you have to look at doing things differently. I mean, you have to constantly be assessing what is our schedule, what is our time commitment. We talked about this like a month ago when we were meeting with Kai and saying like, where are your values? Look at your checkbook and look at your calendar. That shows you where your values are. And so when you start to look at your calendar and you start to look at your schedule and go, does this reflect who we are? The amount of time we invest in these things, is this sustainable? If it's not, as a community, you have to come together and say, how do we address this so that it is sustainable? Because we're not living in the same world.
Yeah. I'm interested, right? Because so I'm hearing you, Zach, right? Like we got to reprioritize some things. We have to stick to our core values. We have to understand. I think the central question, maybe Jessie, right? Like you might ask, like how do we in that reprioritization? How do we reprioritize, or how do we prioritize the mental health of teachers so that they can help sustain the mental health of students?
Yeah,
I think it's maybe a clear way. And Jessie, I don't know if you.
I mean, I definitely am on board with reconfiguring what education looks like. I think that we live in a new world. I mean, post-COVID.
Yeah.
And I think that we've been moving towards more openness and maybe more transparency. And I think that, I mean, to be controversial, I also think that SOTA could be reimagined. I think that a lot of the times it feels like we are sticking to power standards and we're doing the schedules and we're like getting the work in and we're working towards graduation. And I mean, you can cut this out, but like it feels like we're moving away from being a true art school. I think that we need to reimagine, like, why does SOTA exist? Why are we all here? Like, I believe in it. I'm from here. Like, SOTA made me who I am. And I love it, but I think that it could use a makeover. I think that it could be reimagined. I think that there could be new values put into it. I think that for us to have a conversation of like, what do we want the longevity of SOTA to look like? I don't think that that's a conversation that would be worthless.
No, and this is the key though. Like our mission is to change public education. The word change is in the actual mission statement. We have 4 pillars, and the reason we have 4 pillars is so that as we're changing, we're still grounded to our beliefs and what our values are. We have these 4 pillars we're going to stick to. Now, how that gets interpreted, it should always be changing because we live in a changing world. And I think we recognize that like coming out of the last 3 years, we don't live in the same educational landscape. Even just legislatively, there is so much change that's happened in the last few years in terms of like ALE environments and what the state actually considers full-time enrollment and what requirements are even met for graduation, and whether we should waive those requirements or keep waivers in place, and what do we actually need kids to know and be able to do by the time they graduate. Look at what's happening in California with and I think UW even just took this on, of dropping the SAT as a requirement for admission. Like the world is constantly changing and adjusting its expectations to what's happening. And if teachers on the ground level are not involved in that process and questioning, why are we still doing this? Is this who we are? Do we need to change with it? Then we're gonna be way off base. Like what you just said is not controversial. I think it's essential. It needs to be at the center of what we do.
Absolutely. I think that, like, going back to your question about like prioritizing mental health, I think teachers need to be trusted more. That like we too can help guide like education into its new direction, because it never comes from that level. It's always coming from the top down. Every year we're showing up, we're being told where we're teaching, what we're teaching, who's in our classes. I think that having a little bit more room at the table could be helpful.
Like, that's what you just said is so spot on, Jessie.
Yeah.
It's so important. Teachers are on the front lines. You guys need to actually be involved in like working with thinking about how do we reimagine this. Like, how you facilitate that is a challenging thing because we're busy. We're running 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to get everything done. So making space for those conversations is hard. But at the same time, like, if we're not constantly changing and doing that as a group, as a team, then change comes from the top, and you get told this is what the next priority is based on what I was told by my boss, and that boss is reporting to that person, and now we got to all try to get these numbers up and show that that's the most important thing, and it doesn't ever get centered back to who's actually talking to kids. So I 100% believe in what you say. Absolutely. And I mean, it comes back to identity, discovering yourself. Like SOTA, Sammy, and Idea, I believe we are in a constant organizational process of discovering ourselves. Who are we in the context of how we engage with students in the world? And that's grounded in these values of empathy, community, balance, and thinking. But at the same time, it's constantly evolving and changing, and it has to be.
Oh, man, so much. Here's what I'm really excited about, right? Like, because I think that the way that organization should be run is that the end user should have one of the largest voices there.
Yeah.
Right? And so like in education, the end user is students, right? But the closest thing to the end user is also teachers.
Yeah.
Right? And so like, I love the idea that maybe you should ask us.
Right, exactly.
I mean, and it only makes sense, And I also love the idea that you named, Zach, is like, if we're in a constant state of discovery because we don't think that things should be stuck, right? That we should consistently be innovating on ideas. Just, I'm wondering, and maybe a question, because I'm thinking about this as layers down, right? Because we've talked about providing space for students, right, to be able to think about their own identities. We talked about the organization consistently being, right, holding to core values, but being okay with shifting. Like, Jessie, you're a human too, right? And you're consistently discovering your stuff about yourself, even in your current iteration or your current age, right? Like, how do you take your learnings or discoveries about yourself and then bring them into mentor group?
I mean, I think with just like showing up vulnerable and just willing to ask like the hard questions, I think that like right now, like my mentor group is a mesh of 2 different mentor groups. And so I've kind of been the weird mentor, which is really funny because I was always the weird mentee when I was at SOTA too. I was always the kid that they would put in all the new teachers' mentor groups to like teach them how to be in mentor group. And then since I've started working here.
Surprised they didn't put you in my mentor group.
Since I started working here, I've been the person that's always like co-mentored with either older teachers to learn how to do it and then moved in with newer teachers to show them how to do it. And so I feel like I've been in the same role in involving mentor group. But I think that the one thing that I'm always learning outside of myself is that like, outside in my life is that I really don't know a lot, and that the kids like really are the people that have all the like the answers within mentor group. Like what mentor group is supposed to be is what they need. And so being open and just like willing to like let them plan it, to let them tell us like what should it look like? How do you want to be supported? How do you want to how do you want to spend your time here? You know, we have 2 hours, sometimes we have all day. Like that's your precious time. What can I do for you? And then, you know, when they need help, like with assignments, like we're there to do that. When they want to go out and they want to do something in the community, then like I'm super connected in the community. So I'll be like reaching out to like all of my friends and being like, hey, who needs help on this day, or who wants to do this thing, or I have a kid that's like interested in this kind of internship or experience, like how can we make that happen? I mean, it goes back to them and what they need, and I'm just there to like ask the question and then to just be able to like open the door. When I was in high school, like I said, my dad was terminally ill with cancer, and I was like skipping a ton, and I was like saying I was going up to the hospital to spend time with my family, but I wasn't. I was just like out hanging out with my friends. And I remember Robin pulling me aside, who was like, I think I spent the most time in her class. I don't really remember if she was ever my mentor because I got moved around a lot, but I remember her telling me like, you know, your dad isn't gonna like, he's not gonna outlive this thing. This is like, this thing is gonna happen to you, and you have to decide who you're gonna be at the end of it. And it turned out that, you know, her dad had passed away from the same type of cancer. Oh, wow. And that conversation has stayed with me in my entire life. And like, it's the reason I graduated. It's the reason why I continued to dance after high school. And like that vulnerable conversation, like really kicked me into gear where I was like, this isn't happening to me. Like, I am not a victim here. I'm responding to like this hard thing that I'm going through. And I still have the ability to like create who I'm going to be on the outside of it. And I think that like that, without having that conversation and that connection and that like vulnerability between the two of us, I don't think that like I would have made it to graduation at all. Yeah. So thanks, Robin.
That's amazing.
No, shout out to Robin. And I love that there's an example of somebody who has held that balance, right? And been able to show it. And then the fruit of it is like, we get to be in community with you. And I think that that's really beautiful. I'm like, we're at the tail end of a conversation that I don't want to be over. You were going to say something like that?
I was just going to add it. I mean, it almost makes me cry because that's exactly the experience you want about mentorship, right? Like, there's the famous riddle, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, of like, you know, man falls into a hole and like a priest walks by and like says, hey man, like, you're a priest, can you help me? And he's like, oh yeah. And he writes a prayer and throws it into the hole and walks on. He's like, well, that did me no good. Or, you know, like, I'll just use a contextual term, like a social media person walks by, an influencer, and it's like, hey, you know, I'll put out a link to your GoFundMe on Instagram, and it's like, great, I'm still in the hole. And then like finally a friend walks by, or in our case a mentor, and the mentor jumps in the hole, and they're like, what are you doing? Now we're both stuck in this hole. Yeah. But then the mentor says, yeah, but I've been in here before, and I know the way out. And like that is exactly what Robin did, right? Yeah. She's like, I've been in this hole before, and I can tell you what you're about to experience, and this is the way out. This is where we're going to go. That's the balance of like, I'm coming alongside you, but I've also been here before because I'm an adult and I know where to go. Like, that to me is exactly the kind of experience you want to hear about.
Man, and it's gold. And I'm wondering, right, like, because I always think about this relationship, and I tell young people all the time, right, like, always have a mentor in your life. In your case, it sounds like Robin, right? Find yourself in the middle of a mentor sandwich, because there should always be someone you're mentoring as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because the lessons that you learn from your mentor, right, the way that you know them is if you can teach them or facilitate them to someone else. And so I'm curious, right, like, and I guess in our closing question, in a conversation I don't want to be over, I'm curious, right? We've talked about a couple of things along the way, and I don't want to miss this conversation that we're talking about gender identity either, right? Like, you were afforded that balance. You're now in a role where you're mentoring, and I'm curious, right? Like, how do you best support students who are in this stage of exploring their identity, whether that be gender, whether that be something else? But we started there, right? Like, I'm really curious, like, how, because of what Robin has shown you, how does that show up in your experience with some of the more tougher conversations that you think teachers have to navigate in that space?
I mean, I think that even if I can't understand what a student's going through, I think just holding that space, like getting into the hole, you know, I do love that analogy, but because I'm not always going to have the answers. Like, I don't always know what to do, and I don't always know what to say, but like, I know how to hold space. Yeah. And I think that that's the work that I have to do on myself outside of school, right? Like, I have to make sure that like where I'm at is like in a healthy open mind space so that when I show up, like I like actually have that space to hold. And I really want to believe that my mentees know that there's unconditional love when they walk into that classroom. And I want to believe that I am a safe person to be happy with, and that I'm a safe person to be mad at, and that I'm a safe person to tell things to, and that I'm a safe person to laugh with, and all of that. I mean, I love what Steve always says, our social worker. He always says, like, you know, kids are going to have the biggest behaviors with the people they feel the safest with.
Yeah, it's true.
And so even if I don't know what to do, or if I don't feel like I have the skill set, like I know how to hold space, and I just bear down and do it.
Man, I think that's although I don't want it to be over, I think that's a great note to end on, right? I don't have to have the answers. I don't have to have it all figured out, right? But I'm an adult in this space that can hold space. Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. You know, just want to say thank you, right? I know this was a conversation with you, and you, right? As we talk about your rising and your moon.
I don't even know what that means.
I've been so grateful to sit in.
It's okay.
Yeah, you'll know. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending some time with us, and thank you for sharing your perspective.
Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education, or on our website.